Hey guys! Tonight we slip quietly into a vaulted chamber where candlelight trembles against stone walls and every glittering surface feels like it's watching you back. You're standing close enough to the crown jewels that you can almost hear them breathe. Cold, patient, and heavy, with stories no one ever intended you to hear out loud. Gold hums faintly, gems flash like unblinking eyes, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a small voice whispers that this might not end well for whoever puts them on next. You probably won't survive this in one piece, not historically at least, because the deeper you go, the harder it is to believe these were ever just decorations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far these stories travel through the night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't start with curses, you start with hands. Hands digging into earth, prying gemstones from riverbeds, hacking them from mountainsides, lifting them from defeated enemies who are still warm. Long before a jewel ever brushes a royal throat or presses into a powdered wig, it passes through violence so routine that history barely pauses to acknowledge it. This is the first danger, the quiet one, the way power imprints itself on objects and refuses to let go. You imagine the earliest crowns, rough things by later standards, heavy circlets hammered together more for symbolism than sparkle. Mainstream historians agree that early royal regalia functioned less as decoration and more as proof of divine favor. Crowns weren't pretty, they were persuasive. To wear one was to announce that heaven itself had signed off on your authority. The problem, of course, is that heaven had a lot of competitors. Every jewel you see tonight has a backstory that begins with someone losing something: land, freedom, a life. Gold taken as tribute, emeralds seized during invasions, diamonds extracted under conditions so brutal they barely merit footnotes in polite textbooks. And yet when these objects arrive at court, they're scrubbed clean of context, polished until they glow, renamed something poetic like the light of kings or the eternal heart. You're supposed to forget the mud, forget the blood, forget the screams echoing faintly inside the stone. History has always been very good at selective hearing. This is where danger starts to cling. Not because the jewels are magical, although some people absolutely believed that, but because everyone involved knows on some level that power taken by force rarely sits still. It demands repayment, and when it can't find it in armies or rebellions, it finds it in stories. You drift forward in time and notice how quickly language changes. Victories become inheritances, theft becomes acquisition. A crown captured in battle is suddenly described as having returned to its rightful owner, even when that owner is very new and extremely nervous. Wearing such an object is less like accessorizing and more like daring history to contradict you. Spoiler: history loves a challenge. There's a quirky tidbit historians still smile about at conferences when they're feeling mischievous. In several medieval inventories, jewels are listed not just by size and value, but by temperament. Some are described as obedient, others as restless. One particularly ominous sapphire was noted as being ill-suited to weak rulers, which is medieval bureaucrat speak for "this thing has bad vibes, good luck." You can almost picture a monk dipping his quill, sighing deeply, and writing that down as a warning no one will read till it's far too late. You try to imagine being the first ruler to place such an object on your body. The weight alone would be alarming. Early crowns weren't engineered for comfort, they were engineered to impress. Neck strain was real, headaches were common. There are accounts, widely accepted by mainstream historians, of monarchs complaining that their crowns caused dizziness and nausea during long ceremonies, No one calls it dangerous yet. They call it the price of power. But your body, unlike your courtiers, doesn't care about symbolism. And then come the coincidences. A king wears a newly claimed crown and falls ill weeks later. A queen debuts a spectacular necklace and suffers a miscarriage. A prince insists on wearing his father's signet ring and dies unexpectedly before winter. Individually, these are tragedies. Together they start to hum with pattern. Humans are very bad at leaving patterns alone. Historians still argue whether these early associations between jewels and misfortune were sincere belief or retroactive storytelling. Did people truly fear the objects at the time, or did later generations connect dots after the damage was already done? You feel that debate hovering here, unresolved, like a question no one can quite put down without glancing back over their shoulder. You notice something else as you move through these early courts. Who wears the jewels longest? Coronations are brief, triumphs fade, but queens, especially consorts, are expected to wear these objects daily. Heavy necklaces pressing against the chest, rings never removed, brooches pinning layers of fabric so thick they trap heat and sweat. If something is going to go wrong, it's statistically more likely to go wrong for them. History, of course, will later call this fate. There's a light joke whispered among modern curators that if medieval royalty had known about chiropractors, half of Europe's succession crises might never have happened. You smile because it's funny, and then you stop smiling because it's also a little too plausible. Physical strain, poor nutrition, stress, and untreated illness explain a lot. But explanations don't erase fear. They coexist with it uneasily, like roommates who avoid eye contact. As these objects pass from ruler to ruler, they begin to accumulate reputations. Not officially, never officially. Courts are far too careful for that. Instead, the warnings slip sideways, tucked into etiquette. This jewel is reserved for coronations only. That necklace is inappropriate for young brides. Perhaps Her Majesty would prefer the smaller diamonds tonight. Preferences masquerade as tradition. Tradition masquerades as safety. You can feel it now. The way danger is no longer about what the jewel is made of, but about what it has witnessed. Every stone becomes an archive. Every scratch a footnote. Wearing it means volunteering to become the next chapter. And not everyone is eager to continue a story that keeps ending badly. Somewhere along the way, people start whispering that jewels remember, that they absorb ambition, fear, and betrayal the way metal absorbs heat. Is that scientifically sound? Absolutely not. Is it emotionally convincing? Completely. And in royal courts, emotion often outranks evidence. You pause beside a display case in your imagination and think about how many rulers ignored the whispers anyway, because power, once offered, is very hard to decline. Saying no to a jewel can look like saying no to legitimacy itself. That's the trap. The danger isn't just wearing the crown, it's what happens if you don't. And yes, there's a small, darkly humorous truth here. If you believe a jewel is cursed, you're probably already stressed enough to make yourself sick. Anxiety is a powerful accessory. It pairs terribly with insomnia and political pressure. Medieval self-care routines were, let's say, limited. Still, the fear persists because every generation inherits not just the object, but the memory of what happened last time. You don't need to believe in curses to hesitate before placing cold metal against your skin when history keeps clearing its throat meaningfully behind you. By the end of this first chapter, you understand something essential. Royal jewels become dangerous not all at once, but layer by layer, through conquest, through coincidence, through whispered caution, passed like a secret handshake from one court to the next. They are dangerous because they carry too much certainty and too much doubt at the same time. They promise power. They remember cost. And as you step away from that chamber, one thought lingers, slow and heavy. The jewels themselves never force anyone to wear them. People choose to. And that choice is where the real risk begins. You move forward without ceremony because that's how history actually does it. No clean breaks, no gentle fade-outs, just one weighty moment leaning into the next. The jewels don't rest between chapters. Neither do the people expected to wear them. By now, you've noticed that danger sharpens around coronations. These are the moments when jewels stop being symbolic objects and start being physical burdens. The crown isn't just seen, it's felt. It presses down, compressing hair, skin, bone, posture, breath. Mainstream historians openly acknowledge that medieval and early modern coronation regalia could weigh several kilograms, sometimes more. That doesn't sound dramatic until you imagine standing for hours, fasting, sweating beneath layers of fabric, while an entire nation watches for signs of weakness. And weakness, inconveniently, loves an audience. You picture the scene, incense hanging heavy in the air, bells ringing with a frequency that rattles your teeth, Latin words echoing off stone so cold it seems to drink sound. A crown is lowered onto your head, not gently, never gently, and suddenly the world tilts just slightly to the left. Is it nerves, hunger, the weight itself? No one asks. Everyone assumes this is what divine authority feels like. Early accounts mention monarchs swaying, blinking hard, gripping armrests to stay upright. One widely accepted historical fact is that fainting during coronations wasn't rare. It just wasn't written about enthusiastically. Official chronicles describe rulers as overcome with holy emotion, which is a lovely way of saying their blood pressure dropped alarmingly while wearing a gold helmet disguised as destiny. You start to understand how disaster slips in sideways. A ruler collapses days later, another develops chronic headaches, someone else dies within the year, and suddenly the jewel isn't just heavy, it's suspicious. People whisper that it didn't sit right. That phrase comes up again and again in court records, diaries and letters. Not cursed, not evil, just wrong. There's a quirky tidbit historians still love to argue over during late-night panel discussions. Some coronation crowns were adjusted on the fly, stuffed with padding, cloth, even folded parchment, to make them sit properly. That means holy regalia sometimes contained grocery lists, old prayers, or yesterday's paperwork. The crown that symbolized eternal rule might literally include a shopping reminder for lamp oil. Somehow, this makes everything feel more fragile. But symbolism is stubborn. Once a jewel has been worn at a coronation, it absorbs authority like a sponge. It becomes the jewel, the one that matters, the one you must wear if you want to be taken seriously. And if something goes wrong afterward, well, everyone remembers what you wore. Historians still argue whether coronation-related misfortunes were genuinely attributed to jewels at the time, or if later generations exaggerated the link to make sense of sudden deaths and political chaos. The debate lingers because the sources are slippery. Official records downplay superstition, private letters do not, and guess which ones feel more honest at 3 a.m. You follow the pattern repeating across centuries. A king survives the coronation but grows paranoid. A queen emerges pale and quiet, withdrawing from public appearances. A ruler insists on wearing the full regalia again at an anniversary ceremony and falls ill soon after. Courts begin to murmur, not loudly, never loudly, but enough that precautions creep in. Shorter ceremonies, lighter crowns, substitute jewels temporarily, which somehow becomes permanently. This is where danger evolves from physical to psychological. Once a jewel is associated with catastrophe, wearing it becomes an act of defiance. Every itch, every ache becomes suspicious. You start listening to your body too closely, interpreting every sensation as an omen. Stress compounds. Sleep disappears. decisions fray. If you were trying to design a system guaranteed to destabilize leadership, this would be a strong start. There's a dark joke among modern historians that some monarchs were probably killed by anxiety wearing a very expensive hat. You laugh softly because the humor is gentle, but it lands because it rings true. Power doesn't kill instantly, it erodes. You notice, too, how these fears affect women differently. Queen's consort and queen's regnant are expected to endure ceremonies repeatedly, marriages, coronations, baptisms, state occasions, often wearing the same historically charged jewels. If a king collapses, it's tragic. If a queen falls ill, it's confirmation. The jewel doesn't like her, the court takes notes. One mainstream fact appears again and again. Several European courts quietly retired certain coronation pieces after successive rulers died young. They didn't announce it. They didn't destroy them. They just stopped using them. The jewels were locked away, their silence treated as safer than their shine. Objects don't need official condemnation to be feared. They just need a pattern. And patterns, once noticed, are impossible to unsee. You imagine a young ruler approaching their coronation knowing exactly what happened to the last 3 people who wore this crown. Everyone smiles reassuringly. Everyone insists it's coincidence. No one offers an alternative. Refusing would look weak. Choosing a different jewel would look illegitimate. So you comply, heart hammering, skin already prickling beneath the weight of expectation. Here's the strange part. Sometimes nothing happens. Years pass. The ruler thrives. The jewel is declared redeemed until the next one dies unexpectedly and the cycle resets. Safety, it turns out, is temporary. Fear is patient. There's another odd detail tucked into ceremony manuals. Some rulers were instructed not to look directly into mirrors while wearing full regalia. The official reason was humility. Unofficially, some believed seeing yourself crowned too fully invited fate's attention, like staring into the sun or bragging during a horror movie. You know better, you still don't do it. 3 light jokes drift through court gossip like coping mechanisms. Someone mutters that the crown weighs more than the kingdom's treasury. Someone else says the jewels are trying to return themselves to the ground. A third quips that if the crown starts whispering, please inform the clergy immediately. Laughter keeps fear from getting ideas, but fear already has ideas. You sense now that coronation jewels don't cause disaster. They mark it. They become timestamps before the crown, after the crown, before she wore the necklace, after she wore the necklace. Human memory needs anchors, and tragedy loves jewelry because it's easy to point at. As you leave this section of the story, one truth settles heavily beside you. Once danger attaches itself to a jewel worn at the moment power becomes visible, it never fully detaches. Every future wearer inherits not just authority but anticipation. The question isn't whether something will happen, it's when and whether the jewel will be blamed again. And deep down, you already know the answer. You don't notice the danger at first because it doesn't glitter. It doesn't announce itself with omens or dramatic collapses. It works quietly, invisibly, the way most real threats do, through chemistry, craftsmanship, and habits no one thought to question. By the time suspicion forms, the damage has already learned your name. You lean closer to the jewels now, not as symbols, but as objects made by human hands, using whatever materials knowledge allowed at the time. And that knowledge, historically speaking, was enthusiastic but reckless. Mainstream historians agree on one uncomfortable fact. Many royal jewels were assembled using substances we now label plainly as toxic. Mercury, lead, arsenic-based compounds, not mistakes, standard practice. Goldsmiths used mercury to refine gold, a process called fire gilding. It produced a brilliant surface, and as a bonus feature no one advertised, mercury vapor that slowly poisoned anyone who worked near it or wore the finished piece close to the skin. Lead was mixed into alloys to make metals softer and easier to shape. Enamels were stabilized with toxic glazes. The goal was beauty and durability, not long-term wellness. Kings wanted shine, queens wanted elegance. Nobody was asking their necklace how it felt about internal organs. You imagine a heavy collar resting against bare skin for hours. Heat builds, sweat forms, microscopic particles leach. Nothing dramatic happens right away. That's the trick. Symptoms creep in sideways: fatigue, headaches, nausea, tremors, mood swings, easy to dismiss, easier to blame on stress, temperament, or, if the wearer is a woman, delicate constitution. History has always loved that phrase. It explains everything and nothing at once. There's a quirky tidbit that sounds almost too modern to be true, but it's real enough to make historians wince. Some royal physicians noticed recurring symptoms among jewel-wearing elites and advised rotating accessories, not for fashion, but for health. They didn't know why it helped, they just knew it did. Imagine prescribing less crown time as a medical intervention and trying to keep a straight face. Historians still argue whether chronic heavy metal exposure significantly affected royal decision-making, or whether it's a convenient modern explanation layered onto messy political histories. The debate is ongoing because evidence is indirect. Hair samples here, skeletal traces there, letters describing inexplicable illnesses everywhere. It's the kind of argument that never quite ends, just slowly circles itself like a cautious cat. You start noticing patterns that would make any epidemiologist uncomfortable. Multiple members of the same court develop similar symptoms. The most heavily adorned fall ill first. Jewelers themselves, often absent from portraits, die young or go mad. This last detail is rarely emphasized, perhaps because it suggests the danger wasn't mystical at all, it was occupational. And yet superstition rushes in to fill the gap where science hasn't caught up. When a queen develops tremors after wearing a newly commissioned necklace, no one says mercury exposure. They say the jewel doesn't like her. When a king grows irritable and paranoid after months of wearing an elaborate crown, they don't blame lead. They blame ambition, or fate, or the jewel's past owner who died badly and left behind unfinished business. You feel a strange sympathy for the objects themselves. They didn't choose their composition. They were designed to endure, not to harm. But intention doesn't matter much to biology. Poison doesn't care whether it's symbolic. There's a dry little joke buried in modern museum circles that if royal jewels came with warning labels, half of them would read, "Not suitable for prolonged skin contact, may cause delusions of grandeur." You exhale a soft laugh because it's funny, and then unsettling because it's accurate in more ways than one. Queens, again, bear the brunt. Necklaces press against pulse points. Earrings stretch lobes rich with blood supply. Rings trap moisture against skin. And unlike kings, queens are expected to look impeccable for long hours, day after day. If they complain, they're difficult. If they fall ill, they're fragile. The jewel remains blameless until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. One mainstream historical fact surfaces quietly but insistently. Several royal treasuries began commissioning lighter versions of ceremonial pieces for daily wear. Same look, less metal, fewer unknown compounds. Officially, this was for comfort. Unofficially, it was damage control. You don't announce that your crown is making people sick. You just redesign it and hope no one asks why. But people always ask, and when they do, answers get creative. This is where danger acquires a new layer. Now the jewel isn't just heavy with history, it's physically suspect. Touch becomes risk. Proximity becomes a gamble. A necklace might be beautiful, but what else is it doing while it rests against your skin? The fear shifts from what happened before to what is happening now. You catch yourself imagining a court physician standing very still, very carefully choosing words. He knows something is wrong. He doesn't know how to say it without implying that royal power itself might be toxic. So he says nothing. Silence, like poison, spreads slowly. 3 light jokes ripple through this tension because humour is how people survive. Someone quips that the Queen's necklace is trying to reclaim its elements. Another suggests the crown is melting its wearer into the throne. A third mutters that at least poison doesn't require parliamentary approval. Everyone laughs just enough to keep going. By the time science begins catching up, centuries later, the damage to reputation is done. Jewels are remembered not just as witnesses to illness, but as accomplices. Even when modern testing confirms high levels of toxic residue, the myth doesn't disappear. It mutates. What was once chemistry becomes curse. What was exposure becomes destiny. You step back now, understanding something crucial. Danger doesn't need intent. It doesn't need malice. Sometimes it just needs tradition plus ignorance plus time. Royal jewels became dangerous because no one knew when to stop wearing them, or how to admit that beauty, in this case, came with a price. And once that idea takes hold, it doesn't matter how many scientists argue otherwise, the fear has already settled in, comfortable and convincing, right where the necklace would rest. By now, the jewels aren't just objects anymore, they're suspects. You feel the shift the moment diamonds enter the story in a serious way, not as decorative accents, but as stars with names, reputations, and egos big enough to eclipse the people wearing them. Unlike gold or enamel, diamonds arrive already wrapped in myth, unbreakable, eternal, pure. Which is ironic because the moment something is declared eternal, history immediately starts testing that claim. You follow one stone from hand to hand, and suddenly the timeline looks less like succession and more like a cautionary tale. A ruler wears it, then loses a throne. Another inherits it, then loses an heir. A third insists on displaying it publicly, only to be overthrown before the decade ends. Mainstream historians agree that dynastic collapse is usually caused by economics, war, or politics, but that agreement doesn't stop people from side-eyeing the jewel that keeps showing up at the crime scene. This is how diamonds become narrative magnets. They don't cause catastrophe, they survive it. And survival, oddly enough, makes them look guilty. There's a quirky tidbit that still makes archivists raise an eyebrow. Some royal inventories quietly annotate certain diamonds with phrases like ill-starred or formerly worn by the late, followed by a pause that feels intentional. No explanation, just implication. As if writing more would invite the stone's attention. You don't insult something that's already outlived everyone else in the room. You notice how the blame sharpens when bloodlines end. If a dynasty falls without a clear villain, no dramatic execution, no obvious betrayal, people reach for whatever remains. And jewels remain. Palaces burn. Archives scatter. Bodies decay. Diamonds wait patiently for the next coronation. That patience feels ominous if you're already nervous. Historians still argue whether the infamous cursed diamonds of Europe were feared during their own time or only gained their reputations afterward, once enough tragedy had piled up to justify a good story. The problem is that both can be true. Fear can be quiet at first, living in marginal notes and hesitant glances, then roar into legend once someone decides to connect all the dots with a dramatic flourish. You sense how queens especially become lightning rods for this fear. A diamond that passes harmlessly through 3 kings becomes dangerous the moment a queen wears it and suffers misfortune. Miscarriages, stillbirths, early deaths, events tragically common in pre-modern history, are suddenly reframed as warnings. The jewel is accused of rejecting her body. The language is chillingly personal. There's a darkly modern joke hidden in the pattern. If you want to end a rumor, never put it on a woman's neck. That's unfair. It's also historically accurate enough to sting. As these diamonds gain notoriety, courts begin behaving differently, not openly, never openly, but subtly. A stone once central to coronations is moved to a side setting. Another is displayed behind glass instead of worn. A third is given a new name because sometimes rebranding feels safer than confrontation. The diamond hasn't changed. The story around it has. One mainstream historical fact emerges clearly here. By the early modern period, several royal houses began treating certain jewels as heirlooms to be preserved rather than worn. This wasn't framed as fear, it was framed as respect. Preservation sounds noble, avoidance sounds weak. Language does a lot of heavy lifting. You catch a moment of accidental honesty in a private letter. Someone remarks that a particular diamond has seen too much. It's an odd phrase. Stones don't see. But people say it anyway because it captures the discomfort perfectly. Wearing such a jewel feels like inviting all previous tragedies into the room and asking them to sit quietly. 3 light jokes surface again because humor keeps panic at bay. Someone suggests the diamond should be crowned instead. Another says it's clearly more stable than the monarchy. A third wonders aloud if the stone is collecting thrones as a hobby. Everyone laughs, no one wears it. By now, danger has fully detached from physics and chemistry. This is psychological gravity, the weight of expectation, the dread of becoming the next one. A diamond doesn't need poison or sharp edges to be lethal to a dynasty. It just needs a reputation and a human need for meaning. You understand something unsettling as you linger here. Dynasties don't fall because of jewels, but jewels often outlive dynasties, and that makes them perfect scapegoats. They're visible, they're portable. They can't defend themselves, and most importantly, they let people believe that power failed because of an object, not because of human choices. As you move on, the diamonds remain behind, glittering softly, innocent, and accused all at once. They will be worn again, they always are, but now every glance at them carries a question no one asks out loud. Who wore you last, and what did it cost them? By the time you reach this point in the story, the danger has stopped announcing itself loudly. It has learned subtlety. It lives in pauses, in hesitation, in the way a queen's hand lingers just a second too long above a velvet tray before choosing something safer. This is where intuition enters the narrative, not as superstition, but as survival. You notice that queens rarely say no outright. They redirect, they delay, they claim headaches, they suggest alternatives. Mainstream historians agree that royal women often exercised influence through absence rather than confrontation. And nowhere is that clearer than in how they navigated jewelry. Refusing a jewel directly could be read as rejecting legitimacy, tradition, or even the king himself. So they learned to listen to quieter signals. There's a recurring pattern in court records. A queen declines to wear a particular necklace after feeling unwell the previous time. Another requests a duplicate made with smaller stones. A third insists on borrowing a lesser-known piece instead of the famous one everyone expects. No official explanation is given, none is required. Everyone understands what's happening, even if no one names it. A quirky tidbit slips in through a letter written by a lady-in-waiting who notes, almost casually, that her mistress never trusted jewels that had outlived too many husbands. It's written as a joke, but you can feel the seriousness underneath. Longevity, in this context, is not reassuring. It's suspicious. Historians still argue whether queens genuinely believed in curses or whether they were simply responding to accumulated anecdotal evidence and political risk. The truth probably sits uncomfortably in between. When enough people fall ill or die after wearing the same object, belief becomes less about magic and more about pattern recognition. Humans are very good at that, sometimes too good. You sense how this intuition is shaped by environment. Queens live surrounded by stories. They hear whispers before they hear facts. A servant mentions that the jewel felt cold. A courtier recalls that the last wearer never smiled again. A priest suggests caution without explanation. These fragments assemble themselves into gut feeling, and gut feeling is hard to argue with when history keeps nodding along. One mainstream historical fact surfaces quietly here. Several queens commissioned personal jewel collections that existed entirely separate from the state treasury. These weren't acts of vanity, they were acts of control. Private jewels meant private risk, no inherited tragedy, no political symbolism, just adornment, safety disguised as luxury. You imagine the relief of choosing something that hasn't watched generations collapse. And yet, intuition isn't foolproof. Sometimes fear attaches itself unfairly. A jewel blamed for disaster might have had nothing to do with it, but once a queen decides something feels wrong, the body often follows. Stress tightens muscles, sleep fractures, appetite disappears. If she falls ill afterward, the intuition is retroactively validated. The loop closes, the jewel is condemned. 3 light jokes ripple through this tension like soft bells. Someone remarks that the queen's instincts are better than the court astrologers. Another suggests the jewels should come with biographies. A third mutters that if a necklace makes you uneasy, it's probably not worth the headache, literally. Humour doesn't solve fear, but it keeps it from screaming. You notice how male rulers react to this quiet resistance. Some dismiss it as nerves, others respect it deeply. A few grow angry, interpreting intuition as disobedience. Those reactions matter because they shape how much freedom queens have to protect themselves. When intuition is punished, danger doubles. There's an unsettling intimacy here. Wearing a jewel means allowing it against your skin, close to your pulse, your breath, your voice. Queens understand this bodily reality better than anyone. They live in corsets and layers, constantly aware of pressure and restriction. If something feels off, they trust that sensation. Their lives depend on reading subtle discomfort. Historians still argue whether these intuitive choices altered political outcomes, whether avoiding a jewel might have spared a queen illness, or whether illness would have come regardless. It's impossible to know. Counterfactuals rarely leave evidence. What remains is behavior, and behavior tells its own story. You feel a quiet respect settle in. These women aren't hysterical or mystical. They're cautious, they're observant. They're navigating a system that treats them as symbols first and people second. Intuition becomes a private rebellion, a way to assert agency without making noise. As you move on, one image stays with you, a queen standing alone in her chamber, candlelight flickering, jewels laid out before her like possible futures. She doesn't know what will happen if she chooses wrong. She only knows what happened to others who did, so she listens to the small, insistent voice inside her chest, and for once she trusts herself more than the crown. You start to notice that danger doesn't always feel like fear. Sometimes it feels like procedure. By the time jewels reach this stage of their reputation, they've been fully absorbed into politics, not just symbols of power, but tools, quiet, elegant tools designed to test loyalty, obedience, and nerve. You don't announce these tests, you embed them in ceremony and call it tradition. Mainstream historians agree that royal courts thrived on ritual precisely because ritual makes compliance visible. Who kneels correctly? Who wears what they're given? Who hesitates? Jewels become perfect instruments for this because they're intimate. You don't just display them, you carry them on your body. Refusing a jewel is refusing participation, and refusal is very loud in a room built on silence. You imagine a court where one necklace has a history everyone knows but no one names. It has outlived rivals. It has coincided with demotions, imprisonments, quiet disappearances. When it's offered to someone new, a bride, a favourite, a rising figure, the offer itself is the message. Will you wear it? Will you accept the risk for the sake of belonging? There's a quirky tidbit hidden in correspondence between diplomats that hints at this dynamic. One ambassador notes that being granted a particular jewel was less an honour than an instruction. He doesn't explain further. He doesn't need to. Anyone reading knows exactly what he means. Historians still argue whether courts consciously used dangerous jewels as loyalty traps, or whether this was an emergent behaviour shaped by fear and superstition. The truth, as usual, is murky. You don't need a formal policy for something to function politically. All you need is shared understanding. You see how this plays out most clearly with royal women entering foreign courts. A new queen arrives, unfamiliar with the unspoken rules. She's offered jewels that have been worn by disgraced predecessors. The gesture is framed as generosity. If she accepts eagerly, she's pliable. If she hesitates, she's cautious. If she refuses, she's difficult. No outcome is neutral, and the jewel watches. There's something deeply unsettling about how danger becomes bureaucratic here. No curses, no omens, just expectation. You are supposed to wear this. Others have. What happened to them is unfortunate, but tradition must continue. If you believe you are different, stronger, luckier, favoured, then by all means prove it. 3 light jokes float through court gossip like pressure valves. Someone says the jewel is a very expensive resignation letter. Another suggests it's cheaper than a spy network. A third mutters that at least the necklace is honest about its intentions. Laughter keeps everyone from admitting how calculated this all feels. One mainstream historical fact stands out sharply. Some jewels were deliberately reassigned after political scandals, appearing on new wearers almost immediately. This wasn't coincidence. It was signalling. Association matters. Wearing the same object links you, whether you like it or not, to whoever wore it last. Courts understand this instinctively. You feel the tension of a woman being dressed by attendants who know the jewel's history but say nothing. Their hands are steady, their faces neutral. Silence does the work words would ruin. The weight settles against her skin, and with it 1,000 unspoken expectations. Be loyal, be grateful, don't ask questions. And if something goes wrong later, well, you knew what you were wearing. Historians still argue whether this practice was cynical or merely opportunistic. Did rulers intentionally exploit fear, or did they simply fail to correct it when it proved useful? The sources don't confess. Power rarely does, but the patterns are hard to ignore. You also notice how surveillance creeps in. Who touches the jewel casually? Who avoids it? Who makes the sign of the cross when it's brought out? These reactions are observed, remembered, filed away. Jewelry becomes a psychological litmus test. It reveals character, or at least perceived character, without a single question being asked. And then there's the aftermath. If the wearer thrives, the jewel is rehabilitated. If they falter, the jewel's reputation hardens. Either way, the court learns something. Someone was willing to take the risk, someone wasn't. Someone believed, someone pretended not to. This is where danger stops being accidental. It becomes functional. You catch a moment of almost tender irony. Jewels were meant to display stability, unchanging beauty in a volatile world. Instead, they become tools for managing volatility itself. They measure ambition, they expose fear. They bind people into narratives they didn't choose but can't escape. Queens, again, walk the narrowest line. Declining a jewel might protect their health but damage their standing. Accepting it might secure favour but invite scrutiny. Or worse, there's no winning move. only calculated compromise. You think back to earlier sections, to conquest, to poison, to intuition, and realize this is their convergence point. The jewel's danger no longer depends on chemistry or superstition. It depends on people watching what you do with it. As you move forward, one truth settles in with quiet clarity. By the time royal jewels become tools of surveillance, they no longer need to harm anyone directly. The harm is outsourced to expectation, pressure, and consequence. The jewel simply sits there, gleaming, while humans do the rest. And somehow, that makes it more dangerous than ever. By now, the danger has crossed borders. You feel it the moment familiar stories start echoing in unfamiliar languages, the same patterns, the same hesitations, different courts, different crowns, same uneasy glances at the same kinds of stones. What once felt local, one unlucky jewel, one troubled dynasty, now spreads across Europe like a shared anxiety no one formally acknowledges but everyone understands. This is how rumor matures into reputation. Mainstream historians agree that by the late medieval period, royal courts were deeply interconnected. Marriages stitched kingdoms together, ambassadors carried gossip faster than armies, jewels travelled with brides, dowries, and peace treaties. And when a jewel arrived with a history, it didn't arrive quietly. It arrived trailing whispers. You imagine a princess crossing borders with her trousseau, knowing that the jewels packed beside her have already been worn by women who did not fare well. The new court smiles politely, compliments the craftsmanship, asks casually who wore this piece last. The answer lands heavier than the jewel itself. There's a quirky tidbit buried in diplomatic correspondence where a foreign court requests clarification about a necklace's previous associations before allowing it to be worn publicly. Not its value, not its origin, its associations. That single word carries a lot of fear in a very small package. Historians still argue whether this cross-border anxiety reflected genuine belief in cursed objects or a more pragmatic awareness of political symbolism. Wearing a jewel linked to downfall elsewhere might suggest instability, bad judgment, or worse, imported misfortune. In a world obsessed with omens, you don't gamble with optics. You notice how stories evolve as they travel. A jewel linked to illness in one country becomes linked to madness in another. A failed reign turns into a violent overthrow. Details sharpen, timelines compress. The jewel stays at the center, untouched by exaggeration, because it doesn't age the way people do. It remains visually identical, while the story around it grows teeth. Queens again absorb the consequences. A foreign bride is already under scrutiny. Her accent, her customs, her loyalty. Add a dangerous jewel to the mix, and she becomes a walking question mark. If something goes wrong, she won't just be blamed personally, her homeland will be implicated. Suddenly a necklace isn't just unlucky, it's diplomatically inconvenient. 3 light jokes ripple through this tension like shared coping mechanisms. Someone says the jewel should be issued a passport, another suggests it's been exiled more times than most nobles, a third quips that it's the most travelled member of the royal family. Laughter keeps fear from crystallizing into panic. You begin to see how standardization creeps in. Courts quietly compare notes. Certain stones are avoided universally. Certain settings are deemed safe. Jewelers adapt, creating lookalikes that satisfy tradition without importing the baggage. The same design, different soul, or at least that's the hope. One mainstream historical fact becomes clear here. By the early modern era, some European courts maintained detailed records of which jewels were worn during periods of crisis, illness, or upheaval. These weren't superstition logs, they were risk assessments, The language is cautious, clinical, almost modern. Don't wear this during sensitive times. Avoid that during pregnancy. Substitute when possible. You pause on that last detail. Pregnancy. Queens already navigate terrifying odds. Anything associated with loss becomes radioactive. A jewel linked, even loosely, to stillbirths or maternal deaths is quietly retired from use by expectant women. No announcement, no decree, just absence. Silence becomes protection. Historians still argue whether these practices reflect belief or behavioral adaptation. Did people think the jewel caused harm, or did they simply refuse to tempt fate? The distinction matters academically. In real life, the behavior looks exactly the same. You feel how fear becomes collective now. It no longer belongs to one court or one family. It's inherited alongside the jewels themselves. Even skeptics participate, because skepticism doesn't shield you from gossip. And gossip, in royal circles, can be fatal to reputation long before it touches your body. The jewel's danger is now self-sustaining. Every time it's avoided, its reputation deepens. Every time it's mentioned in a warning, its myth hardens. Ironically, the less it's worn, the more powerful its story becomes. Absence feeds legend. You step back and take it in. A continent quietly agreeing not to test certain objects anymore. No councils convened, no proclamations issued, just a shared understanding passed hand to hand like contraband knowledge. As you move on, one realization settles gently but firmly. Once fear goes international, it stops being questioned. It becomes tradition's shadow. And tradition, as you've already learned, is one of the hardest forces to challenge without paying a price. The jewels gleam behind glass now, perfectly intact, while stories ripple outward endlessly, proof that danger doesn't need borders, only believers. You feel the tone change here, subtle but unmistakable, like a room cooling when a window cracks open. This is where danger stops being just whispered and starts being warned against, carefully, indirectly, wrapped in incense and authority. This is where priests enter the conversation. For centuries, the Church insisted that objects themselves were morally neutral. Gold was gold, stones were stones. Sin lived in people, not things, and yet mainstream historians agree that clergy were deeply invested in symbolism, and symbolism has a habit of slipping into moral territory whether you invite it or not. When jewels became too closely associated with pride, downfall and suffering, theological discomfort followed. You imagine a confessor leaning closer, voice low, advising a queen to consider humility when choosing her adornments. He never mentions the jewel by name. He doesn't need to. She already knows which one he means. The warning lands softly but firmly. Some objects invite attention that the soul may not be ready to bear. There's a quirky tidbit preserved in sermon notes where a bishop compares certain royal jewels to relics handled without reverence. Powerful not because they are holy, but because people believe they are. The implication is unsettling. If belief gives an object influence, then misuse of that belief becomes spiritually dangerous. The jewel isn't cursed, it's corrupting. Historians still argue whether clerical resistance to certain jewels stemmed from genuine spiritual concern or from anxiety about unchecked royal excess. Probably both. Jewels represented wealth, vanity, and temporal power, all things the Church liked to keep on a short leash. When a necklace seemed to bring ruin instead of glory, it was convenient to frame avoidance as piety rather than fear. You notice how language shifts in religious spaces. Jewels aren't unlucky or dangerous, they're inappropriate, excessive, a distraction from duty. These words sound mild, but they carry weight, especially when delivered by someone who can deny absolution or subtly question your moral fitness. Queens again feel this pressure most sharply. They are expected to embody virtue visually. Too much sparkle invites suspicion. A jewel with a troubled history invites outright concern. If she wears it and suffers, it can be interpreted as divine correction. If she avoids it, she's praised for modesty. Either way, the jewel loses ground. One mainstream historical fact stands out. Several religious advisors explicitly discouraged the wearing of inherited regalia during periods of crisis, plague, war, famine, arguing that visible opulence risked provoking divine displeasure. Jewels that had already been linked to misfortune were the first to be sidelined. Why tempt God when the people are already suffering? 3 light jokes flutter through the tension because even clergy had a sense of irony. Someone jokes that the jewels need confession more than their wearers. Another suggests that gold attracts sin the way honey attracts flies. A third mutters that maybe heaven just prefers simpler accessories. The smiles fade quickly, but they help. You feel the unease deepen as spiritual consequence is layered onto political and physical danger. Now, wearing a jewel doesn't just risk illness or rumor, it risks moral judgment. If something goes wrong afterward, it's not bad luck, it's a lesson, and lessons are rarely gentle. Historians still argue whether this theological framing intensified belief in jewel-related danger or simply legitimized an existing fear. Either way, the result is the same. Once avoidance can be justified as righteousness, it spreads faster and sticks harder. No one wants to argue against God's supposed preferences. You imagine a jewel being removed from ceremony, not because it's heavy or infamous, but because it's no longer fitting for sacred occasions. That phrasing appears again and again. Sacred, fitting, occasion. The jewel hasn't changed, the context has, and context, in matters of belief, is everything. What's striking is how little resistance there is. No protests, no defenses of tradition. The jewel simply disappears from use, placed in a reliquary-like box, stored near altars but never worn. Its danger is acknowledged without ever being named. As you move on, one realization settles calmly beside you. Once spiritual authority aligns with fear, the argument is over. Jewels don't need to harm anyone anymore. They only need to look like they might offend something higher. And in a world where eternity is taken very seriously, that's reason enough to leave even the brightest stone untouched. By now, the jewels aren't just old, they're restless. You feel it in the way stories tighten whenever theft enters the narrative. Conquest was one thing, war followed rules, however brutal. But stolen jewels carry a sharper edge, because theft suggests imbalance. Something taken improperly wants, somehow, to return. At least, that's how people begin to tell it. Mainstream historians agree that many of Europe's most infamous royal jewels changed hands, not through inheritance or treaty, but through betrayal. Midnight flights, coerced abdications, hurried exiles where crowns were grabbed, more like luggage than legacy. These weren't ceremonial transfers, they were desperate ones. And desperation leaves residue. You imagine a jewel ripped from a treasury during a coup, shoved into a satchel alongside letters and loose coins. It doesn't get a farewell ritual, no blessing, no acknowledgement, just absence. When it reappears years later in another court, it carries that abruptness with it. The story starts whispering immediately. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into an inventory from a reclaimed palace, where a jewel is described as having been recovered, though not reconciled. That phrasing is odd, almost emotional. Objects don't reconcile, people do. And yet the archivist felt the need to note that something about the jewel still felt unfinished. Historians still argue whether disasters blamed on stolen jewels were truly connected to the act of theft, or whether societies simply struggled to integrate objects that symbolized unresolved injustice. A jewel taken without closure becomes a reminder that order was broken. If later chaos follows, the mind links them eagerly. cause feels comforting, even when it's wrong. You start noticing how often tragedy follows the jewel, not immediately but eventually. A ruler who flaunts a stolen gem faces rebellion, another who inherits it loses allies. A queen wearing it becomes the focus of resentment she can't explain. The jewel becomes shorthand for illegitimacy. You don't need to know the full story. You just need to recognize the stone. 3 light jokes ripple through anxious halls. Someone says the jewel is trying to go home. Another suggests it has abandonment issues. A third mutters that perhaps the stone prefers honesty over ownership. The laughter is thin. Everyone understands what's really being said. One mainstream historical fact emerges clearly here. Reclaimed jewels were often subjected to elaborate re-blessing ceremonies before being worn again. Not always religious, sometimes legal, sometimes symbolic, but always deliberate. Courts understood that stolen objects disrupted narrative continuity. You had to rewrite the story before you could safely continue it. Queens again find themselves at the center. Wearing a reclaimed jewel is a public declaration that the past is settled, that the theft no longer matters. If the people don't agree, the jewel becomes a lightning rod. Every misfortune she suffers reinforces the idea that the object was never truly forgiven. Historians still argue whether this dynamic reflects belief in object agency or simply political projection. Was the jewel angry, or were people angry about what it represented? The sources don't resolve this. They circle it, avoiding direct accusation while describing consequences in careful detail. You feel how exhaustion sets in. At some point, courts stop trying to rehabilitate these objects. It's easier to lock them away than to keep explaining them. Silence, again, becomes safety. The jewel is preserved physically but removed narratively. It exists, but it no longer participates. And yet, absence doesn't erase story. If anything, it sharpens it. A jewel no longer worn becomes more mysterious, more potent. People imagine what it might still be capable of if released again. Danger, it turns out, thrives in storage. As you step forward, one thought settles quietly beside you. Stolen jewels don't just carry the memory of theft. They carry unresolved questions about legitimacy, justice, and return. Wearing them asks everyone to agree that the past is over. And history, as you've probably noticed by now, is very bad at agreeing to that. You reach a strange turning point here, where the glow around the jewels dims just enough for reason to peer in, not triumphantly, not loudly, just cautiously, like someone opening a door they've been warned not to slam. This is where explanations begin to change shape. For the first time, danger is questioned rather than assumed. Mainstream historians agree that by the late 18th and 19th centuries, medical and scientific thinking had advanced enough to challenge older narratives. Illness was no longer automatically divine punishment. Collapse wasn't always fate. Stress, diet, infection, and environment started appearing in official explanations, quietly, politely, without directly accusing tradition of being wrong. You imagine a physician examining a trembling monarch and choosing his words carefully. He doesn't mention curses, he mentions exhaustion, he doesn't accuse the crown. He suggests shorter ceremonies, fewer hours in regalia, more rest. It's a revolution, disguised as bedside manner. There's a quirky tidbit buried in court medical notes where a doctor recommends limiting contact with heavy ornaments during periods of strain. That's it. No elaboration. Just a sentence doing a lot of work. It's the closest thing to saying, maybe the jewelry is the problem, without risking exile. Historians still argue whether these early scientific explanations genuinely replaced superstition or simply layered over it. The answer, predictably, is both. You can understand mercury poisoning and still avoid a jewel that everyone associates with death. Knowledge doesn't erase memory, it just gives it new vocabulary. You start seeing shifts in behavior that are subtle but significant. Crowns become lighter, ceremonies shorten, queens appear in public wearing fewer inherited pieces and more contemporary designs. Jewelers are instructed to recreate famous items using safer materials, while the originals retreat into vaults. Officially, this is modernization. Unofficially, it's retreat. One mainstream historical fact stands out clearly. The rise of constitutional monarchy coincides with a dramatic reduction in the daily wearing of regalia. Power becomes symbolic rather than embodied. Jewels follow suit. When authority no longer depends on spectacle, the risk attached to spectacle suddenly feels unnecessary. But here's the uncomfortable part. You notice that even as science advances, fear doesn't disappear, it just adapts. Instead of curses, people talk about associations. Instead of dooms, they say optics. The jewel isn't dangerous, it's problematic. Same avoidance, new language. 3 light jokes drift through the era, softer now. Someone says the crown has retired earlier than expected. Another quips that the jewels prefer a quieter life. A third mutters that science saved more necks than armor ever did. The laughter is calmer, less desperate. You feel the tension between explanation and experience. A historian can list 10 rational reasons why a ruler fell ill after a coronation. A court can list 10 more reasons why wearing that particular jewel still feels like tempting something best left alone. Rationality doesn't cancel instinct. They coexist awkwardly. Historians still argue whether modern explanations should strip jewels of their reputations or preserve them as cultural artifacts shaped by belief. Is a dangerous jewel dangerous because it harmed people or because people believed it could? The question matters academically. Emotionally, it rarely does. You notice how this debate plays out in museums. Objects are displayed with neutral plaques, careful wording, measured tones, but guides lower their voices when they mention certain pieces. Visitors lean in. Even now, with all we know, the stories still work. As you move forward, something settles gently in your chest. Understanding doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes it just explains why fear made sense at the time. Royal jewels became dangerous not because science failed, but because it arrived late, after enough damage had already been done to make caution feel wise. And even when knowledge knocks politely, history doesn't always answer the door. You feel the weight shift again here, not heavier, just broader. The danger surrounding royal jewels expands outward, no longer confined to palaces or bloodlines, but tied to something much larger and harder to ignore. Empire enters the room, and it doesn't come quietly. By the time colonial power peaks, mainstream historians agree that European royal treasuries are filled with objects that did not come from nearby rivers or familiar mountains. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds. Many arrive through conquest, coercion, and extraction on a scale previously unimaginable. These jewels aren't just inherited, they're imported, and with them comes a new kind of unease. You notice how the stories change tone. Earlier fears centered on personal misfortune, illness, infertility, sudden death. Now the whispers widen: unrest, rebellion, moral decay. Jewels taken from colonized lands begin to symbolize not just power, but guilt. Wearing them feels different, heavier somehow, even when the design is lighter. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into parliamentary debates where a critic sarcastically refers to a royal diamond as exceptionally well-traveled, noting that it has crossed oceans more often than most citizens. It's meant as humor, but the room reportedly goes quiet. Everyone knows what's being pointed at. Historians still argue whether the moral backlash against colonial plunder directly influenced how often these jewels were worn, or whether practical concerns, public opinion, political reform played a larger role. The line between ethics and optics blurs here. Sometimes avoiding outrage looks exactly like avoiding guilt. you start seeing patterns that would have been unthinkable earlier. Jewels once paraded proudly are suddenly confined to vaults. Others appear only in portraits, not on living bodies. When they do surface, explanations follow quickly. Loan agreements, legal ownership, careful phrasing about shared heritage. The jewel itself hasn't changed. The audience has. Queens again carry the sharpest edge of this shift. A woman wearing a colonially sourced jewel becomes a walking symbol of empire, whether she wants to or not. If unrest follows, strikes, protests, uprisings, the timing feels ominous. The jewel becomes a focal point for anger that has nowhere else to land. 3 light jokes float through the tension, brittle but present. Someone says the jewel has seen more suffering than sparkle. Another suggests it should come with a map. A third mutters that perhaps the stone is tired of being admired. The humour lands awkwardly because the discomfort underneath is real. One mainstream historical fact stands out with clarity. During periods of heightened anti-imperial sentiment, royal appearances featuring lavish jewels declined noticeably. This wasn't accidental. Advisors understood that objects could provoke as much reaction as policies, sometimes more. It's easier to remove a necklace than to justify an empire. Historians still argue whether belief in jewel-related danger merged with emerging moral consciousness, or whether the two simply overlapped conveniently. Did people think the jewels were punishing their wearers, or did they feel the weight of history pressing back? Either way, avoidance became the safest option. You sense how danger evolves yet again. It's no longer about what the jewel might do to the wearer. It's about what it represents to everyone else. Power taken violently doesn't age well. When displayed too openly, it attracts scrutiny. Scrutiny breeds instability. Instability looks like bad luck. The cycle repeats under a new name. You pause on the irony. Jewels once symbolized global reach, wealth beyond borders, dominion over distant lands. Now that same reach makes them volatile. Too much history clings to them, too many eyes know where they came from, too many voices are ready to remind the wearer. As you move forward, one truth settles quietly but firmly. Colonial plunder didn't just load royal jewels with material value, it loaded them with unresolved moral debt. Wearing them became less about glory and more about whether you were prepared to answer for the past, publicly, visibly, and without flinching. And for many rulers, that risk felt far more dangerous than any curse ever could. You start noticing the quiet absences before you notice the rules. There's no proclamation announcing that certain jewels are no longer worn, no scandal, no confrontation, just a gradual disappearance from portraits, ceremonies, and public memory. This is where resistance becomes subtle enough to survive, and where royal women, in particular, become experts at saying no without ever opening their mouths. Mainstream historians agree that many queens and princesses exercised influence through choice of appearance, especially in eras when their formal power was limited. Clothing and jewelry became a language, and like all good languages, it allowed for nuance, omission, and plausible deniability. You picture a state occasion where everyone expects a legendary necklace to appear. It doesn't. Instead, a simpler piece takes its place. No explanation is offered. None is demanded. The absence speaks clearly enough. If asked, the answer is always practical. Comfort, appropriateness, taste, never fear. There's a quirky tidbit hidden in wardrobe accounts where a queen repeatedly requests repairs on a specific jewel, delaying its use for years. Each time it's nearly ready, another alteration is needed. The jewel remains in the workshop indefinitely, trapped in a loop of almost. It's bureaucratic avoidance at its finest. Historians still argue whether these quiet refusals were conscious acts of defiance or instinctive adaptations shaped by collective memory? Did queens sit down and decide deliberately never to wear certain jewels again, or did the habit simply fade as safer alternatives became available? The evidence supports both interpretations, which is historians speak, for we can't prove motive, but the pattern is obvious. You feel how effective this strategy is. Openly banning a jewel would invite debate. Quietly sidelining it invites nothing. Over time, tradition rewrites itself. The jewel isn't forbidden, it's just no longer part of the conversation, and what isn't talked about stops feeling necessary. 3 light jokes flutter through the dressing rooms. Someone remarks that the jewel is enjoying early retirement. Another suggests it's been promoted to museum artifact. A third quips that absence is the most elegant accessory. The laughter is gentle now, not defensive. The fear has softened into preference. One mainstream historical fact becomes clear. Many royal collections today include extraordinary pieces that were rarely, if ever, worn by their intended owners. These weren't rejects. They were risks. Their preservation isn't accidental, it's strategic. Keeping them intact but unused satisfies tradition without activating consequence. You notice how younger generations inherit this behavior without needing explanation. A princess grows up never seeing a particular jewel worn. She doesn't ask why, she simply understands that it belongs to the past. And when she ascends, the pattern continues effortlessly. Fear doesn't need teaching when absence does the work. Historians still argue whether this marks the end of belief in jewel-related danger or its quiet success. If no one wears the object anymore, does it still hold power? Or is that power proven precisely by how carefully it's avoided? The question loops back on itself. Unresolved, you sense a kind of relief here, not triumph, but calm. The danger hasn't been defeated, it's been managed, contained. The jewel rests, its story preserved, but no longer pressing itself against living skin. As you move on, one realization settles softly beside you. The most effective way to neutralize something dangerous isn't always to destroy it. Sometimes it's to let it fade from use so completely that no one remembers when it stopped being an option. And in royal history, that kind of quiet control is as close to safety as anyone ever gets. You arrive at a place where the story refuses to settle. Everything so far has been pattern, response, adaptation. And now you stand in the long hallway where historians argue softly but endlessly, their voices overlapping like footsteps echoing out of sync. This is where danger becomes a question rather than a conclusion. Historians still argue whether royal jewels were ever truly believed to be dangerous or whether danger was a narrative built afterward to make sense of lives already lost. It sounds abstract, academic. It isn't. Because how you answer that question changes who you blame. The object or the system that insisted on using it. On one side, you have scholars who point to coincidence, stress, biology, and politics. Monarchs died young because life was short. Queens suffered because childbirth was brutal. Regimes collapsed because power attracts enemies. Jewels were present, yes, but so were stairs, horses, and bad medical advice. Correlation, they insist, is not causation. On the other side, you have historians who focus less on physics and more on perception. They argue that belief itself alters outcomes. If a ruler believes a jewel is dangerous, or knows others believe it, that belief shapes behavior, decision-making, stress levels, and public reaction. In that sense, the jewel becomes dangerous not by magic, but by meaning. You feel the tension between these views because both are persuasive. A crown doesn't poison you by intent, but wearing something believed to be cursed can absolutely erode confidence, heighten anxiety, and magnify scrutiny. Historians still argue whether these psychological effects are enough to justify calling a jewel dangerous, or whether doing so gives superstition too much credit. There's a quirky tidbit from a symposium transcript where one scholar jokes that jewels are the most overqualified supporting characters in history. They don't act, they observe, they survive, and yet they're remembered more vividly than the people who wore them. The room laughs, then goes quiet, because it's uncomfortably true. You notice how debates intensify around queens. When a king fails, historians cite policy. When a queen fails, historians still sometimes mention what she wore. This imbalance isn't accidental. Objects are safer to blame than structures. Jewels become convenient shorthand for discomfort with female power. One mainstream historical fact anchors the debate. Many of the jewels labelled dangerous were worn repeatedly without incident by some rulers and disastrously by others. The inconsistency resists simple explanation. If the jewel were truly cursed, wouldn't it always harm? If it were harmless, why does the pattern feel so persistent? Historians still argue whether storytelling itself created the danger retroactively, whether later chroniclers exaggerated jewel-related misfortune to add drama, coherence, or moral lesson to chaotic events. A fallen dynasty reads better when it has a symbol. A cursed gem is easier to remember than a tangled web of economics and war. You feel how unresolved this all remains. Museums hedge, textbooks hedge. Tour guides lower their voices just enough to invite curiosity without committing to belief. No one wants to declare the jewels innocent. No one wants to call the fear foolish. The story lives in the space between. 3 light jokes drift through academic circles like pressure release. Someone says the jewels should publish memoirs. Another suggests they've survived more peer review than most theories. A third mutters that if objects could testify, history would be much shorter. Humour keeps the argument human. You step back and see the larger picture. Royal jewels became dangerous not because everyone agreed they were, but because no one could fully agree they weren't. Uncertainty is fertile ground for fear. And fear, once institutionalized, behaves a lot like truth. As you move on, one thought settles gently but firmly. Maybe the real danger was never in the jewel at all. Maybe it was in the human need to assign meaning to suffering, and the relief that comes from letting an object carry that burden instead of ourselves. The debate doesn't end here. It never will. And somehow that's exactly why the jewels still feel unsettled even now. You can feel how different this part of the story is even before you name it. The danger hasn't vanished, but it's been domesticated. Contained. Framed by glass, velvet ropes, and insurance policies thicker than medieval walls. This is where modern monarchy steps carefully around its own inheritance. Mainstream historians agree that contemporary royal households treat historic jewels less as personal adornment and more as institutional assets. They are catalogued, insured, conserved, and, most importantly, controlled. Wearing them is no longer a rite of status. It's a decision weighed by advisors, optics teams, and public sentiment analysts. Power has learned caution. You picture a jewel resting in a climate-controlled vault, untouched for decades. Not because it isn't magnificent, but because it carries too much narrative density. Too many associations, too many risks. Modern monarchies understand something their predecessors didn't. Spectacle can destabilize faster than it can reassure. There's a quirky tidbit from a conservation report noting that certain jewels show almost no signs of wear, despite being centuries old. They were preserved meticulously and avoided deliberately. Their pristine condition isn't evidence of reverence, it's evidence of restraint. Historians still argue whether locking jewels away represents rational modernization or the quiet continuation of ancient fear. Are monarchies protecting fragile artifacts, or protecting themselves from history repeating in public view. The official explanation favors preservation. The subtext suggests risk management. You notice how protocol replaces superstition here. Certain jewels may only be worn once per generation. Others require specific occasions, lighting, or combinations, never alone, never too prominently. The rules read technical, but they function like spells. Do this, avoid that, and nothing bad will happen. 3 light jokes drift through modern commentary. Someone says the jewels finally got time out. Another suggests they've been promoted from accessories to exhibits. A third mutters that glass cases are the best exorcism invented. The humor is casual now, but the avoidance remains real. Queens and consorts navigate this landscape with practiced ease. They select contemporary pieces for daily visibility, leaving historic jewels for moments so carefully staged they barely feel real. If something goes wrong today, it can't be blamed on a necklace. That narrative has been retired along with absolute power itself. One mainstream historical fact is undeniable. Modern royal scandals rarely involve jewels directly. The danger has shifted elsewhere, to media, to politics, to personal behavior. And yet the old jewels remain untouched, as if everyone agrees they're better off not testing whether the stories still work. Historians still argue whether this marks the end of jewel-related danger or its final evolution. When belief fades but behavior persists, what remains? Habit, memory. Institutional muscle memory passed down without explanation. You sense a strange calm here. The jewels aren't feared anymore, but they aren't trusted either. They exist in a liminal state, admired, documented, untouchable. Power, once pressed into flesh, now keeps its distance. As you move toward the final stretch, one realization settles gently beside you. Modern monarchy didn't defeat the danger of royal jewels. It learned how to quarantine it. Glass, silence, and protocol succeeded where denial never could. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is proof that the stories were powerful enough to change behavior, even centuries later. You arrive here quietly because this is where the story exhales. Nothing dramatic happens now. No final curse, no jewel cracking in half, just a long view backward and a clearer understanding of why the danger never really left. Even after belief faded, royal jewels are still here. They still glitter, they still stop people mid-step when they catch the light. And that, you realize, is the point. Danger didn't survive because the jewels were deadly. It survived because they were unforgettable. Mainstream historians agree on something deceptively simple. Objects that endure longer than human lives accumulate meaning whether we want them to or not. Jewels don't forget. They don't decay at the same pace we do. When everything else changes, laws, borders, beliefs, they remain stubbornly the same. That stability can feel reassuring or threatening. There's a quirky tidbit noted by a modern curator who once said that some jewels feel too complete, as if their stories already know how they end. It's an odd way to describe an object, but it makes sense. When you stand before a stone that has outlived empires, it's hard not to wonder what it will still be here to witness next. Historians still argue whether the danger of royal jewels was ever real in a physical sense, or whether it was always a mirror held up to human fear, guilt, and ambition. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe danger doesn't need to be measurable to be effective. Maybe it only needs to influence behavior. You've seen how it worked. Conquest gave the jewels violent origins. Ceremony pressed them into fragile bodies. Chemistry poisoned quietly. Rumor stitched patterns together. Politics weaponized fear. Religion moralized it. Science explained parts of it. Modernity locked it away. At every stage, the jewel stayed still while humans changed around it. 3 final light jokes drift through the silence, gentler now. Someone once said the jewels deserve hazard pay. Another joked they've survived more rulers than the throne itself. A third muttered that if stones could sigh, these would. The humour lands softly because the tension is finally easing. You understand now why jewels became too dangerous to wear? Not because they killed indiscriminately, but because they concentrated history in one place. Wearing them meant volunteering to carry everything that came before, every failure, every rumour, every unresolved question. And humans, it turns out, are not built to carry that much past on their skin. The danger outlived belief, because belief was never the engine. Memory was. As long as people remembered who wore what before they fell, the risk remained alive. As long as stories clung tighter than facts, avoidance felt wise. So the jewels rest, behind glass, in vaults, in silence, still powerful, still watched, still capable of unsettling anyone who stands too close for too long. And now, as the last images soften and the glow dims, you can let your shoulders relax. The weight lifts, not just from your neck, but from the story itself. The chambers grow quiet. The jewels stop watching. The past loosens its grip. Breathe slowly. Let the fan hum. Let the night hold you.